Bouncing Statistics presents Hear My Voice. We are bringing the NHS, the West Midlands Police and the community to one open conversation.
Invite others. And again, I want to thank Ifti and also Bushra, who are also here, in Sukkar as well, part of West Midlands Police. And please understand that this is a partnership, it's a collaborative effort, and we're here to look at some solutions and to improve relationships between the police and also the local community. So thank you, Ricky.
Yeah, perfect. Once again, thanks for everyone for joining in. Just going to give it a few more minutes, really. Start at 10 past. So today, as you said, from where we've came, talking about my own perspective and how I've got here, me personally, I was pretty skeptical, for being totally honest. As probably Sukbin knows, I see Bushra smiling as well. She knows I probably always complain, like, oh, it's not happening quick enough. But kind of seeing Richard with his position in the force as well, and him getting on board and kind of supporting the mission, for me, being, let's say, a member of the public and being a normal person, that made me realise, actually, I know it sounds a bit ironic, but they're all not that bad, because a lot of people were trying to support this narrative and trying to change it. Once again, I see Sukbi smiling as well, Suki. But we've got to be honest if we're doing this one today. And for me, I do want to see a bit of a better relationship, I know, with a lot of us having the younger generation coming forward. And, you know, it's not necessarily one side versus the other side, even though often society perceives it that way and our surroundings do make it happen and push it towards that narrative, really. So hopefully today, as I said, one of many, and we can keep pushing. And once again, thanks everybody for tuning in today. So yeah, in terms of the protocols, so Beresford, do you want to touch on the protocols for today?
Okay. Simply put, the protocols are, we want people to join in. This is an interactive discussion. We want you to put your questions, your comments into the chat, and we're going to try and also ensure that we respond to every question. And again, Richard North and his team, we're here to take as many questions as we possibly can within this discussion. We're going to be looking at, preventing crime, fairness in policing, protecting the public, and of course, the legislation and the law. And unless we start to unpack that, unless we start to understand that, we can't move forward. People have perceptions about stop and search. And I remember as a young man growing up in Lozells, Handsworth, those were very real issues. And some of those issues in terms of race, ethnicity, and the police still exist today. And unless we get involved in the dialogue, unless we get involved in the discussion, things are not going to change. So it's really important that, one, young people lead this discussion because the impact is biggest on them. And secondly, that we do engage with the police around the discussion so that we can see what's happening in America. I hate to mention that, where we can see some of the destructive behaviors and the destructive relationships between the American police and the communities there. We're not saying that's going to happen here. We know that there are challenges here, but we have to start to have real discussions about that. And this is the first of many. So please understand that we want you to join in. Don't just sit back. You must have a view. You must have children and families and carers. We want you to take part in this discussion. It's a really important discussion. And again, the pandemic is teaching us that we have to improve our relationships with our local police force. And also, we also have to think about some of our responses and some of our how we navigate some of the challenges that we face, particularly around inequalities. So I think, are we almost ready to start, Rakeem, you think? Or we're going to give it a few more minutes?
I think we can go into it if you want to. I think it works nicely.
Okay.
Start, yeah.
So first up, I think we want to talk about, before we go into the legislation proper, we want to talk about some of the police policies around fairness in policing. And we're going to ask Bushra and Suki, really, just to talk to us about the policy around fairness in policing. And then once we do that, we're going to go straight into the legislation and the law. We're going to have Richard North, if he would, to speak to that. So just over to you, Bushra, and also Suki.
Hi everyone, yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, my name's Sergeant Bushra Zarif. I'm the Neighbourhood Sergeant for the Harborne Neighbourhood Policing Team and work out of Harborne Police Station. I've been a police officer for 29 years, worked in a variety of roles across the West Midlands. My role currently involves neighbourhood policing, so we look at kind of long-term, medium to long-term problem solving, and kind of looking at putting in intervention and prevention around some of our victims and our offenders. So predominantly that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. Suki, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, evening all. I'm Suki Kaur, I'm a PC, and I work in diversity and inclusion in fairness and policing. I've recently come over to this role for about a year, and a lot of my work is to do with the fairness in how we police and how our interactions with people. It's looking at the legitimacy. So there's quite a lot of work that we're doing and that we're learning along the way and the journey. So a lot of my work currently has been to do with stop and search and how that interaction affects individuals and how they perceive the police going forward. There's also my colleague here as well, Hobbs Bashir, if he wants to say hello.
Hi everyone, my name's Hobbs. I work with Suki on fairness and policing as well. And just like Suki, I've been on the department for just over a year now. It's an interesting role. It's very different to what we've done before. You can appreciate. We spend the vast majority of our service working frontline, either in uniform or like myself on the CID. And we have a real insight into what happens out on the street. And being ethnic minority officers as well, I think we have a unique insight where we see two sides of the story, I suppose. I took the opportunity, just like Suki, to work on fairness because I decided that I wanted to be part of a change in the culture of how the police work, how they police, and the kind of stuff that we. And so hopefully, yeah, we're all here to listen and to learn from what you guys have got to say as well. So thank you.
I just wanted to add to that as well. In terms of obviously being in fairness and policing, for myself, you kind of touched on why it is that you, let's say, crossed and made that transition. But what has been the difference for yourself, really working in that side of policing? Because to be honest, before yourselves, I didn't know that it existed, if I was being totally honest. So how's that been for yourself, Suki?
Well, originally, my background's, I've been in the job for about 14 years, so I've done a bit of response policing. For those that know, it's the blue lights, it's the officers that deal with the immediate jobs that come in. And then following that, I went into investigations, into CID. I did investigations, but then there was the issues of recruitment. Why aren't we recruiting more ethnic minorities, females into the organisation? And me personally, I struggle to understand that concept because I am from the ethnic minorities, I'm a female, and all I ever wanted to do was join the job. Since joining, I've had an amazing, journey so far. So that's why I came into diversity and inclusion to try and, tell my story as to, how it is within the organisation. And then following that, I started doing work within fairness and policing. And as like Hobbs said, coming from an operational policing point of view and coming in and looking at things in a different perspective, it was a big eye-opener because you start seeing things from the community perspective, which you probably don't when you're investigating crime or you're dealing with crime. And then you've got that balance of looking at things as a police officer, but yet still as a member of the community that get affected by a lot of issues. And as Hobbs said as well, we're learning a lot along the way. And the only way we can learn and improve ourselves is by having that help from the communities that are affected by particular issues in policing, especially with stop and search, and trying to establish how we can make that interaction more fair for those that are involved and not leaving a negative impact, which starts having an effect on our recruitment of people wanting to join the organisation, whether as a police officer or a police staff.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Suki. That was excellent. I just want to throw in a question here to probably to Ifti and Bushra, really. So what does fairness in policing look like on the ground? we've just heard about the recruitment and how important that is, and that's right. But what does that look like? Fairness in policing. What is that beginning to look like in terms of the changes on the ground?
Thanks, Beresford, for the most difficult question that you could throw at us. So, Ifti Ahmed, having retired from policing after 30 years, in the last 10 years been kind of prominently involved in stop and search, how we do it, how we improve it, and the scrutiny around stop and search. Finished policing last year. I'm pleased to say that I've started at Staffordshire University as a lecturer in policing, and that's influencing young police officers that join the police service, including West Midlands officers. So another next chapter. So Beresford, that is a key question. Our chief commented on it this week on a monthly blog. I think he does a regular blog, and he talked about legitimacy and diversity, and in particular trust with the black community. And we know that if you're young and black in the West Midlands, you're 5 times more likely to be stopped and searched. And we're recruiting. Suki's doing a great job in that department alongside Hobbs, but we're struggling to recruit young black people, whether it's male or female. And that's an area that we need to address, because if you want legitimacy, we need to look like the public that we police. And we've got a section of the community that don't want to join the police for whatever reason. And that's something we need to address. And we are not blind to the fact that there's a trial running at Birmingham Crown Court for a case in West Mercia, but people will associate with that with West Midlands, where a ex-professional footballer died at the hands of the police, if I can put it that way, and the officers are on trial for murder. So there is lots to be done, even though we've made significant progress. And obviously what happened in America is it plays out here, and the Black Lives Matter movement. So I suppose the answer to your question is that we recognise we need to do more, and we've got a department, a team that are focusing on that, but it's a responsibility for everyone in the policing, whether it's neighbour policing, whether it's CID, whether it's response, that we get it right with all communities. But in particular, I think we need to focus on our relationship with the black community, and hence today's conversation, I suppose. And we'll improve that, Beresford, by one, proximity, so really close with the community, albeit via Zoom, which is great, thanks for sorting it. And 2, we need to change the narrative. We need to get officers to listen and speak differently. So I think that there's plenty there to get on with, Beresford.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Ifti. And again, we want to understand as well. So we're starting to open up the conversation about what it looks like on the ground. And part of the job of the police is to protect the public, right? And we're talking about protection. So they've already identified that they're there to serve, and it's about protecting the public. I wonder if Bushra, if you could help us with that. I know you head up one of the biggest neighbourhoods in Birmingham. So the job around protecting the public, help us as a community to understand what that means as well.
I mean, ultimately, we are the people that are called upon when people are in need, and we're here to, reduce harm to the public and to protect the public. And ultimately, as a police officer, I believe you're in a privileged position when somebody's at their lowest or in their crisis moment. It is us that turn up to jobs to deal with whatever that situation is. So I think, in terms of kind of what does fairness look like? Fairness for me looks like having honest dialogue with our community members, investing in engagement. And I think from a neighbourhood perspective, it's something that we do on a daily basis. We speak to our residents, we work collaboratively with our statutory partners. We kind of talk about what's important to the people, the communities that we serve. So for me, I think that fairness piece, runs through all aspects of policing, really. And ultimately, we rely in this country on policing by consent. So, we need the public to have trust and confidence in what we do, and, to be confident that we are going to deal with things fairly and transparently. And I think certainly from a neighbourhood perspective, and my team, as I said, we have that regular engagement. We seek out opportunities, and one of the things Rakeem and I have been working on as part of this piece of work. Rakeem came in and delivered an input around, you know, the kind of impact of stop and search and from a perspective of the Black community, of the young Black community, and that was really positive. So I've got currently 5 young students on my team, and they took part in that training, and they were really, really pleased, and really they found it really insightful. So for me, I think that piece of work, or this piece of work, you know, should lie at the heart of anything that we do as a police service. Hobbs, have you got your hand up? I just wanted to bring you in.
I have indeed. First, I'd just like to go back to fairness and policing on the ground as far as police officers are concerned.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the first things we did, we went back to look at exactly what fairness means. There was a seminal piece of research, academic research done in the 70s, that highlighted and identified 6 key components of fairness. We're trying to sort of design those key components into everything that we do. We've highlighted a number of pathways as well, which we think will help us achieve more legitimacy. They include, and I'll just go back to my notes to make sure I don't make any mistakes, but essentially procedural justice, and I'm happy to explain that, police performance, legal legitimacy, distributive legitimacy and justice, but also traditional, historical, cultural legitimacy as well. And that's perhaps the most important, because that is, sorry, this is to explain that. So I'll just turn my phone off, someone's calling me. I'll just give you my example. Boy from Balsall Heath who decides to join the police in 2003. Nobody in my family had joined the police before, and the simple reaction from most of the people that I sort of mixed with and who I was related to couldn't believe that I was doing it. They had nightmare stories about their interactions with the police. And so for me to go and do that, I had to take on not just the responsibility of getting through the process of the application and the training and everything else, but I also had an additional, almost like a weight to carry. And this was the sort of weight of the responsibility of my family expectations that they had. And I believe, if I'm honest with you, a lot of people expected me to fail and to walk away from it. Those opinions were valid. Those opinions are real. You know, it's no secret. A lot of the guys that I went to school with have been in trouble with the police, have been in jail, and have done some pretty horrendous things. That wasn't me. That was never me. But the thing is, if you grow up in Balsall Heath, that's the kind of exposure that you have, and that's your environment. And that's one of the key things that we're trying to identify, and we're trying to work through here as well.
Brilliant, and thank you for being so candid about your experience, because I think that's what this series of programs are about. We want to talk to the real people behind the force, because we need to start to connect. And you talked about procedural stuff and the historical stuff, H. Can I just ask you just to expand on that a little bit more, because we know about the historical stuff from a community's point of view, but we want you to talk to us about what that means in terms of the procedures, and also if you could touch on that procedural bit and the fairness.
So procedural justice is about having fair interactions. It's around having fair processes, making sure that the processes that you have in place internally and externally they're not just done ad hoc. Things are thought about thoroughly before we go into making a decision or having an interaction with someone. We have to think about things like dignity and respect around giving people making sure that we have trustworthy motives when we're into an interaction with someone, and that we're neutral. Having that neutrality and all of those other components as well, make sure basically essentially it guarantees, or it doesn't necessarily always guarantee, but as long as we're genuinely and honestly applying those principles, usually what we find is when we treat and apply those principles, the interaction is a successful one. It's one where we're not having to use force if we're dealing with someone out in the streets. It's one where we're getting, a good result, and it's one that doesn't leave a bad taste in the other person's mouth, essentially. Okay, that's probably the realest way to put this. But making sure that the information that we have is accurate, making sure that we're suppressing any bias, we're ethical, we're giving people a voice, and we're consistent as well. But also, and it's very important, we have to design in an element of correctability. Essentially, if we make a decision, we have to be able to make sure that we can change that decision if we then do a risk assessment and think actually something's changed, or we've got the run of the sticks if we're dealing with someone out in the street. Exactly the same principles apply internally as well with some of the decisions that we make and the process that we have in place. Essentially, if we're fair inside and we're fair outside, we'll increase legitimacy. And one of the most important elements of increasing legitimacy is a reduction in crime and an increase in trust with members of the public. That's procedural justice in it. But there are other elements, things like legal legitimacy. So if the legal system is working and the people that are in front of the courts are being dealt with fairly, and offenders are then given sentences that reflect their crime, this also increases legitimacy as well, because people believe in the legal system. If, for example, I was to go and stab someone and then I did 3 weeks of remand, you'd all sort of question the processes that are in place. You wouldn't have any faith in the legal system, and that happens all the time. We see disproportionality in sentencing sometimes, but those decisions aren't ours. They sit with the Crown Prosecution Service and often probation services as well. So there are lots of different ways that we can ensure legitimacy. Police performance again is a massive one. I was very quick, so I know you're all getting bored. But police performance is massive. If the police service that are serving your community aren't performing, are doing really badly in handling the calls and response times, all of that trust that we have is going to be eroded. That's a natural consequence, and that's why we have to take that seriously as well.
Brilliant. That's really helpful. Rakeen, can you take that question in the chat for us, Rakeen? It's a question from Dawn.
Because what I was going to do, I was literally, because obviously for me, being a public member here, a public figure, all this legitimacy, it sounds good, it sounds polished, it sounds great, but once again, bouncing statistics, the numbers don't lie. So for the people, obviously members of public here, I don't want you to come in here and think, obviously, if I was someone sitting in the crowd right now listening, I'd be thinking, it sounds good. It's all pure-hearted, clean-hearted intentions, but let's look at it really for what it is. It's not fair. It's not right, as you said earlier, in terms of 5 times more likely. I know we've done some work as well, Suki. All these statistics don't lie. And in particular, I think the question said, why is the focus only on recruiting more black and brown police, and why we're not explaining why there is so much stop and search? I think with regards to that one, not to push that aside, I think we can probably touch on that a little bit more further down the line because we've got it on our agenda directly. But I do like to say, in terms of the point, obviously the fairness in policing, I think, Hobbs, you've kind of put it as to where it should be, where we want it to be, and as members of public and myself even, where ideally I would like to see it. But I'd have to be totally honest, and I'd be lying right now if I said it's there, because it's not. Because as we said, we'll touch on certain things afterwards in terms of the impact as well, and we'll blatantly see, and we can have a real dissection as to why it isn't that way and it isn't legitimate, really. So in terms of our next step, I don't know if you want to pass on to the legislation and just give a little bit of a background. Yeah. But before you go into that, Beresford, I think for me as well, people listening, this is an important aspect for the younger people and the younger generation. I know that, Suki, you thought about as well in terms of how, as once again, the fairness in policing, letting young people know their rights. But a lot of us don't know their rights. And this is an issue in terms of contact every single time. So I don't know if you want to touch on that now as well, Beresford, if you could, that would be perfect, please.
Yeah, so it's starting to get warm up now. I can see people getting warmed up, and remember, it's an engaging conversation. I don't want people to just sit there and just leave it to me and bounce into statistics to facilitate this conversation. This is a space that we've created whereby we really want lots of interaction. So we're about to talk about the law and legislation. We've got Chief Inspector Richard North with us, or Chief Superintendent, sorry, Richard North with us, which is really important because, again, to have Richard supporting this, he is the person that manages the head of force and response. So your questions that you need to put to him, this is the opportunity. But before we start putting our questions to him, I want Richard, if you would join us, please. And we want to hear about the legislation. We want to hear about Section 60, PACE. We want to hear about Section 136. These are the things that are impacting the community. So I'm going to ask you to break that down for us, if you would, Richard. So first of all, Richard, thank you for being with us today. I know you're a very, very busy guy, but you've committed to all 6 sessions, and where you can't attend all 6, we know that your colleagues will cover for you. So Richard, thank you for joining us and welcome. Please come and just talk to us, give us an introduction about your role, and then start to talk to us about the law, legislation, and police.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for inviting me. It's great to be here. So yeah, my name is Richard North. I'm in charge of Force Response, which is department in West Midlands Police that basically responds to 999 incidents and urgent incidents we need to get to. So it's a very large department. It's got over 1,000 officers in it, and we do discharge a lot of police powers from arresting people, seizing property, and we do a lot of searching of people, which I'll come on to talk about. But I'm also the force lead for the fair and effective use of all police powers. So in that sense, I'm well placed to kind of try and answer your questions and take them on board. And that question I've noted, and I'll make sure I come back to it as I kind of work through what I'm going to talk about. I've been in the police for over 20 years. It's probably the only proper job I've had. And, you know, one of the things I do think is I do recognise all the challenges and the impact that the use of those police powers have, but I do think there is a real opportunity now to try and move these things forward. And the reason I say that is because there has been some genuine changes. So one of the things is the change of technology. So now we're able to, officers all wear body-worn video, and we've really pushed over the last 12 months to make sure that as many interactions where police powers are used are recorded on body-worn video. And we're now got up to certainly in my department, and over 95% of stop searches are recorded on body-worn video. And that gives us loads of opportunities because it allows us as supervisors in the police to check what officers are doing, but it also allows those to be scrutinised. So as we come out of COVID, we really want to work with the community to invite you in to look at whatever searches you want and to give us feedback about how you think the officers did that, the fairness of it. And I suppose also, you know, this is about creating that two-way conversation, is showing sometimes the challenges that officers face as well, but also recognise that we can do things better. So I think that's a real step forward. I also, you know, I can't emphasise enough how things have changed. Like our chief constable is totally committed to, you know, improving relationships, rooting out people in the police who don't share the force values. And, you know, those force values are exactly what you would want to see in terms of, you know, accepting when we get things wrong, wanting to learn from mistakes, wanting to work in a diverse team, and all of those things. And the chief is right behind that. So, you know, that's where I think there is this opportunity to move things forward. Having said that, I don't want to disregard what's happening now or disregard what's happened in the past. And I also recognise that, you know, things that happen internationally or across the UK also have an impact on the way we sort of police our communities here. So I'm happy to talk about any of that. But I do just want to say that I do think this is an opportunity, and I'm really committed to having that conversation, learning from your feedback. And I suppose it's also, without bigging myself up too much, even though Beresford put me down a couple of ranks earlier, I'm able to take that back into the organisation because I have got some influence over it. I'm in charge of a lot of police officers. I do meet with the chief constable and senior officers often, so I'm able, what you say, I'm able to take back and influence the organisation. I think in terms of the legislation, I think the things to emphasise, rather than going through acting section, is that the bottom line is Parliament have given these powers to the police around stop and search. Essentially what that means is that if a police officer has reasonable grounds to suspect, and I'll come on to talk a little bit about that someone in a public place, broadly speaking, has got an offensive weapon on them, bladed article or a prohibited article such as drugs, they can search that person. And when they do so, they have to go through certain things they need to explain to that person. But that reasonable ground to suspect, I suppose, is the contentious bit in the legislation. So it can't just be based on officers' prejudice or previous experience. It has to be based on the facts that they see in front of them. So most straightforwardly, it could be because a witness has pointed someone out and said that person has got a knife on them, and the police officer would be able to, on that sort of straightforward scenario, form a reasonable suspicion and search them to see if they have got a knife on them or not. And if they have, they would be arrested, the knife would be seized, as you would expect. The more contentious aspects are around that reasonable suspicion may be built up because the officer perceives that someone is acting suspiciously. And that could be because they've run off from police. It could be the way they're acting. It could be that they are, they've seen them climbing over someone's back fence and they can't explain why they're doing that. So it's that interaction with the person could form that reasonable suspicion. And that's where, to a certain degree, the use of that power is subjective. And that's where the challenge comes, because, what's important is the officer's able to document that, explain it, and justify what they've done. And it kind of feeds back to the body-worn video point, that we can scrutinise that, and potentially the community can come in and scrutinise how those decisions are being made. What I would say is that the use of body-worn video isn't a legal requirement. That is more of a West Midlands police policy. So you don't have to have a body-worn video to conduct a stop and search. Sometimes things happen quickly, officers don't turn it on, so that's why there's that 5% gap. But we've moved that on a great deal. But just to make that point, that isn't actually the law to have it on. But what is the law is that the officer should explain the grounds for the search to that individual who's being searched. So they need to say why they've got that suspicion. They need to tell them what the object is that they're looking for. The officer needs to identify himself or herself and tell them what police station they're from. And that person's entitled to the record of that search. And they also have to explain the legal basis. And they also have to tell the person that they're detained. That last bit's important because the police under PACE are empowered to use force to complete that search. So that's another power that Parliament has given the police service to do that. So force can be used if necessary. That could involve whatever's, only what's absolutely necessary in the circumstances is informed by the Human Rights Act. But depending on the level of resistance and the threat posed, then that's the whole spectrum of force could be legally used depending on the scenario. Section 60 that Beresford mentioned there is an important thing, I think, to cover, because that again is quite contentious. So Section 60 allows the police in certain circumstances to temporarily designate a geographical area, which should be quite small and focused normally, but depending on the circumstances, where the simple fact of being in that area, the police can search you without having to have that reasonable suspicion. They can only designate an area to have that if they have reasons to believe, not suspect, so that's a higher threshold, that serious violence will take place and there's likely to be offensive weapons in that area. So that could be followed. Normally it would be, sometimes we might get intelligence about, say, football fans meeting up to have a confrontation, and they might be armed with knives. So we might say around the area of, say, a particular pub, we might have a Section 60, we were just going to search everyone. It could be following a really serious incident that we would put that power in place. So sometimes we do get community feedback. People will say, I just got searched 2 or 3 times in one location. And obviously people, that has a large community impact. Often that is because of that Section 60 process being put in place. Now, Section 60 requires a senior officer to put, they can't just be done just by a normal police officer, for want of a better way of putting it. In an extreme situation, it can be done, I think, by an inspector, but normally Section 60, because we recognise the impact on the community, has to be done by a superintendent, and actually West Midlands policies that is overseen by an assistant chief constable, so a very high rank. But the fact is we have utilised Section 60s in the West Midlands area in the last 12 months, certainly before COVID. So they do have a significant community impact. I think there's some questions popped up that I haven't followed, so I'll let Beresford and sort of manage those. But the question that was sort of raised earlier, why is there so much focus on recruiting people from a minority background and not concentrating on the amount of stop and searches? I suppose the first thing to say is there shouldn't be a single stop and search that can't be justified and that isn't lawful. So I suppose that's the issue, that's the heart, that's the rub that we've come to debate and I've come to answer questions about. So we don't have a target for the amount of stop searches that we do at all. Officers aren't held to account about how many they do or don't do. Everyone needs to be justified. Everyone is looked at by a supervisor, and about 90 to 95% of them are recorded on body-worn videos, so they can be looked on detail. So, you know, I can't say that we've got a policy to try and reduce that number, or that it's too many as it stands. We do a lot of stop searches. We've done about 13,500 since November 2020, which is a lot. We would say, from our perspective, 27% of them have had a positive outcome. What that means from our perspective when we say positive outcome is that we found something that's of a criminal nature. And that could be, to be transparent with you, a small amount of drugs, which isn't one of our priorities, but it's obviously still something that is illegal. But of those searches I've identified, we have found nearly 400 knives. So you could say that's a small proportion, but obviously there's a tremendous amount of very serious incidents, death and serious injury that result from the use of knives. So that's something that we would emphasise as, you know, that positive side of it. But and the other part of this is that we want the police force to visibly represent the community that we're policing, and that's, we've been going through a long period of austerity where we've been reducing the amount of officers in the force, and there's been no real significant opportunity to improve that. But now recently, the government have we are recruiting, and we want people to join us and to police their own communities and influence the way that we work, and build that confidence in the communities. That's why we're so desperate for people to come and join us. So hopefully that goes some way to answer the question, even if you don't agree with all the points. But Barry, so that's kind of, I think that just gives a sort of succinct overview of the legislation. You don't want to go on forever about Act and Section, but I think they're the sort of contentious points really to pull out from my perspective.
And thank you for that, Richard. They are contentious points. The use of body cams is clearly helpful, but as we're feeling on the ground, it's still 5 times more likely. And reasonable grounds, how we determine reasonable grounds for stop and search. And what I want to do there, so just bear that in mind, Richard, before we come back to you. But I'd like to go to JZ. The questions are in the chat, but it's really helpful that some of the people that are putting the questions in the chat, we want to hear from you. So JZ, if you could just speak to your question, please, that would be really helpful.
He's nicknaming you here.
That's his name on the chat, man. So I'm trying to just stay with the name. Thank you for joining us, JZ. Just, you want to put your question to us, please? Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Just reiterating again, evening everyone. Thank you again, Bats and Statistics, for putting this on. It's a great space, and I'm glad it's an open space where we can freely ask these questions. My first question was, how diverse is the fairness department that Suki and H are within? And sort of touching on Dawn's question, as we all need educating, and I'm sure there's a lot of great officers, as I said, but understanding, is there a need for more Black and Asian officers? I understand there is a need for more Black and Asian officers, but also the education of other white people, whoever you are. I think my question is there still a need for education within that? Because there's still going to be people within the system that might slip through the system. So how do you identify these certain officers that might need that extra education? Sort of a 2-part question.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think the first thing to say is, you're right, we want to reflect that our West Midlands Police want to be more representative of the community, but the bottom line is that's not just for tokenistic reasons. We've got to make sure that everyone in the police force is working to the force values. And you're right. And the reality of it is, even if we were incredibly successful at recruiting, the reality is, over the next few months and years, West Midlands Police is going to be disproportionately white. And that is, the way it is, unfortunately. And it's not something we're celebrating, but that is just a fact. So what that does mean is, your point is a really good point, in that the officers in the West Midlands Police need to work to those values. We need to improve the way they interact with the public at all times, and to approach everything in a procedurally fair way. All the points that Suki was emphasising, and the team were emphasising earlier. I think where the body-worn video, and I keep going on about it, but it is a massive opportunity, because it means we can see what people are doing, and we can see what they're doing under pressure, and when they get, they're dealing with hostility, how they're reacting, and we can give that direct feedback to them, and they can't really argue with it because because it's recorded. But also we can get another perspective on that, so that's a real opportunity. But I also think because we've got more control during this recruitment over how we're training people, we can take that feedback and actually start to influence the training. Because a lot of this is, I think in the past, we've been too focused on getting the law right, which is important, but not enough focus on how we're doing that. So that sort of, we call it like the Go Wisely checklist. So G for grounds, O for object, etc. So I think officers are just going, right, as long as I get that right, it doesn't really matter how I interact. But my reflection is, and what I will say to people is, you could get that slightly wrong, which isn't great because we do want it to be lawful, but you could leave that person understanding why they were searched and not. But if you did it badly, they might hate the police for a whole generation. So those are the sort of things we need to emphasise. Suki, in terms of the point of how diverse your team is, you're probably better placed to say than me. I don't know.
I would say the department's quite diverse. We've got quite a good mix of diversity. I mean, in our team with fairness and policing, there were 3 of us, myself, Hobbs, and our inspector Dan Popper, who is a white male. But we have recently recruited 2 more officers into the team. One who is a black female, and she's got a lot of service in the force, and another white female who comes with a lot of experience of the job. But more than the diversity aspect, I would think it's the understanding that officers have about different communities and different cultures. I would say it's that education that you get with your colleagues. And, sometimes it's not a case, we can become a little bit, like set back in our own lives, our own routines. And if we haven't had that exposure to different cultures and communities, how do we educate ourselves? We educate ourselves through schools, through our friends, family, and a lot of it is in our workplace. So like if we do have colleagues that we've worked with, that's how we educate ourselves. And that's why it's so important to be representative of the communities that we serve. So when we do deal with particular communities, if we're aware of certain aspects that might offend them, we would be a lot more careful as to how we conduct that interaction. So a lot of my work is to do with stop and search. So when I started my work last year, it was a case of like, what is the issue with stop and search? When we look at our statistics and complaints, there weren't that many to do with stop and search. However, soon as a stop and search goes on social media, the comments and everything are coming, so negative. But where is that disconnect? And as Mr. Norse mentioned, that we as officers go wisely, so we follow our path as to making sure that search, that stop is legal. So sometimes we do become robotic because we've become so fixated on making sure we don't do it wrong. We don't get complaints. But then sometimes we lose that human aspect. We lose that touch where, let's just do it nicely. Like, yes, we've got to introduce ourselves. How about saying, look, I'm Suki, I'm from Wolverhampton Police Station, and, this is a reason. But because we've got a procedure that we want to follow in our head to make sure we do it properly, we kind of lose that human interaction. And sometimes that's how a stop and search can be perceived as a negative interactions when, the reasoning it isn't there, and sometimes the adrenaline etc. takes over. So there is maybe that education part on officers to do that reflective practice, looking at the body worn videos and taking stock of what's been said. So the body worn footage that we do view, I think that plays a big part in officers actually thinking, what, I didn't look at it in that point, or I didn't realise my tone was coming across so aggressive. So we have started doing a lot of reflective practice following these stop and searches.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Suki.
Yeah, Beresford, I just wanted to add to that. I think from my perspective, once again, on this side of the fence, just here, kind of obsessing and, observing what's going on. I think when I personally delivered the training session to the officers, it's not necessarily from my kind of observation, it's not the new officers, because they've kind of grown up in a more diverse society. So they understand different people. They understand how to go about things. I personally think it's the ones that have probably been there 10, 15, 20 years and kind of teaching the ones that are coming up how to talk. Because for me, when I was speaking, it's about manners and respect. I don't care who you are. And I feel like a lot of officers as well, unfortunately, because, and it might be portrayed as, oh, because you're obviously wearing this uniform and you have these powers and you turn robotic and you're following whatever procedure, you forget that you're actually talking to a human being, regardless. And a lot of the times where you are, let's say, deployed in these areas, I know we spoke about as a collective in our personal meetings, a lot of us don't really want to liaise and interact with the police anyway. So from when they don't want to have the conversation, I know a lot of younger people, which are going to talk on the impact as well, that don't want to have that conversation, coupled with bad communication. I personally believe it's a recipe for disaster. And before we move on, I just want to say, Bushra, I know you're still here. How do you think that was perceived for you? Because I know that was your team as well, in terms of the education and people that have been there longer as well.
I think there's a real danger that once officers have kind of become embedded in police culture, that a level of cynicism sets in, and some of it that is linked to bad practice, some of that is linked to I think genuine fear. I know, Rakeem, we talked about this after our training session, that there were officers there that were scared, and that kind of risk element was a big factor around how they dealt with stop and search, and the idea that they would handcuff automatically because they wanted to, they were aware of their own personal safety. So I think you make a really valuable point. The young, the impression I get, having been, in the service for nearly 3 decades now, the young people that are coming through the ranks, they get it. They're alive to the issues. They're aware of what's happening globally. But it is that middle ground, that kind of those officers of 5, 10, 15 years experience who have maybe, experienced, incidents where they've stopped and searched, or they've got assaulted, or, there's been some level of aggression or resistance, and that can kind of change officers' behaviour. And I think, Suki makes a really good point around the whole reflective piece, and the fact that now, as a supervisor, I have access to people's body-worn video. When I know one of my officers has done a stop and search, I will view that footage, and I have had occasion to sit down with an officer and do a debrief and say, hang on, that wasn't acceptable, what you did, and get them to kind of understand how that was impact the person that they were dealing with. So I think, that there is a reality, the youngsters get it. I think the middle ones, they need some work. They certainly need some work. But, it is about that first line supervision. It is about supervisors having that scrutiny and having that overview. Do you want to add to that?
Rakeem, we come as a double act, you get 2 for the price of 1. So I think your issue about culture and long in service officers is a really good one. We didn't recruit from 2010 till 2018, I think, because of everything was shrinking and budgets, etc. So there's officers, so that fresh blood coming through stopped for almost a generation or a decade, and now that's starting, so that's good. But I can't underestimate the significance of body-worn video. Every single search, I left policing about a year ago, and we were only recording about 65% of our stop and searches, because probably that 40% didn't want that scrutiny. Those those experienced officers were quite smart. Well, I never got around to put my body-worn on. So senior officers like Richard North said, no, actually, we've made it compulsory that every stop and search, every use of force, every domestic we go to, we used to have that before, but these legitimacy powers that sit at the heart of controversy, we need to have them captured. So now they are being captured, and that is changing behaviour. We have far less complaints from the public in regards to what officers are doing. We identify officers that have overstepped the mark, and they're the ones that are going to court and getting prosecuted or resigning or being sacked. So body-worn is huge, and I think the fact that we're doing that, we will start, and we are seeing a change in how officers behave and how they conduct themselves, and that's only going to be a good thing.
Brilliant. So, as I said before, this is now starting to shape up into the discussion that we want. And just before we go to impact, I want to go to some people who are asking some great questions in the chat. I want to go to Michelle first, and then we're going to ask Marcus, if you would, to speak to your question. And then I hope I've got this name right, Larissa. I'd like you to pose your questions as well. And we're not trying to highlight you, we just want you to speak to your points because they come across better when you speak to them yourself. So Michelle Kelly, if you could just speak to the points that you've made in
Good
the
evening,
chat.
everyone. I'm Michelle Kelly. I am a community member and here off my own back. No one sent me. Some of the things I do within my community is I run an organisation that specialises around mental health, and that's a really important part for me because mental health and policing has been something that's really impacted my life. I'm also a stop and search trainer with the Police and Crime Commissioner's Office, not here in my capacity as that trainer, but just really wanted to share some of my experience around some of the questions. In terms of like scrutiny, I also sit on an affiliated scrutiny panel, and I work alongside some really, really robust officers that help to sort of like educate me around their processes, etc. But part of that scrutiny is that we will review some stop and search cases, just how they're implemented. And one of the key things we do is check whether or not the legal threshold is met for that stop and search. We're able to feed that back and the line managers then take that back to the officers. But one of the things that we think is really important as part of that scrutiny is that when we see officers that deliver a really robust and respectful stop and search, we also feed that back because we want that type of behaviour replicated. They are actually recruiting. They have a number of panels, and what they would like to see is more people like are in this forum sitting on those panels providing the scrutiny. They want the representation of scrutiny to be people that are actually experiencing stop and search. So if I will put my details in the chat and I will forward it on to my line managers just in terms of that. But really good process if you really want to get engaged from a community perspective, just to sort of like have an input into what's going on in your community. I think it's really, really valid.
Yeah, thank you for that, Michelle. That's really helpful, and again, as Michelle said, I know Michelle in terms of some of the work that she does in the community. So Marcus, you're up next, sir.
Yeah, so my question was based around essentially stop and search. There was the whole respect and manners thing that Raheem had mentioned before, and I think because a lot of people don't necessarily know their own rights, if you're being stopped by somebody who isn't directly showing you that respect, that manners, you can automatically have your defenses up. And I think that can lead to escalation of the situation where people are having not necessarily miscommunication, but a different way of viewing the situation. One person's following it by the book, the other person feels like their personal space, their rights are being violated. So my question was, which Michelle's answered, are there any resources? As if there are resources, had anyone thought about signposting these in the areas where people are being stopped and searched more so that they know their rights? Because with an understanding of knowing their rights, they can therefore understand the situation a lot more. These things aren't taught in schools, understand it probably because there's a lot of things that they need to teach in schools. But for somebody to find out this information, they have to do the research off their own back. And if you're not planning to be stopped and searched, you're not necessarily going to look for that. So the information might be lacking. So therefore, is there any thoughts within the police system that have said, okay, right, this is an issue. Can we at least educate some of these people that are being stopped and searched, are being targeted potentially, or we have to stop them for whatever reason, whether it's their profile because they may have this or they may be in a certain area where the crime rate's high. Is there any source of education for those people or a signpost to say, okay, look, can we get this information out to these people that we're stopping? So that was more of my question.
Great question, Marcus. That sounds like
I think, sorry, Barry. So yeah, I was just gonna, sorry to jump over you then.
Go ahead.
I think it's difficult to get that message out to everyone. I suppose what the legislation is saying is that really the officer doing the search should explain the rights and entitlements through that process, which I know is not is problematic because it's dependent on that officer doing that, and they're already in that kind of potential confrontation because the whole nature of the process, they're being accused, aren't they, implicitly of doing something criminal, or they wouldn't have been stopped and searched. But really, that's what, they're entitled to be explained why they're being stopped, what's being looked for, and their entitlement to that search record. Beyond that, I know what you're driving at. It would be it would be better if we could just get that community understanding around what their rights are. And I think there's a broader set of rights. You know, you've got the right not for a police officer not to be rude to you. They should treat you with respect, and they should act lawfully and respectfully and all that kind of stuff. And it'd be nice to think that that was universally sort of understood. But I agree with you. You know, I'm not really aware of a massive drive to improve that understanding of the rights in the community, and I think it's a good point. I think a lot of the problems we get is just generally a lot of police powers are just misunderstood, and a lot of it's picked up from soap operas and TV programs where they're showing police procedure that's just not accurate and police behaviour that's not accurate. But you know, just picking up on a point around that, which is related, is we get very few complaints about stop and search, which is concerning, given that the anecdotal feedback we get is quite negative, particularly from the black community, but we don't get those formal complaints. And I know people get frustrated when they do complain that it doesn't always lead to something as tangible as they would like, but it's really important that that feedback does go back in so that we can follow it up and build up a picture. So, I mean, my other reflection on it, I know there was I can't remember the name of the charity that was pushing on that issue, trying to improve community understanding around their rights and entitlements. And their mantra was to get people to stay calm in the moment, know their rights and complain later. And the irony of that is, from my perspective, that's what I want people to do as well. And most police officers do. You know, we want to everyone stays calm. That stops tension building on both sides, force being used, people getting injured. People knowing their rights is really important, so they see it as fair. And if it's not right, then complain. You know, come and complain later, and then we can follow up and build up a picture of what I would say is a minority of officers that we do need to address their behaviour. So, yeah, that hopefully that answers that to some degree.
Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Richard. And again, we want to move as quickly as we can. We've got Larissa, you're next. And then if we go back to Dawn. Larissa, are you there? Have I pronounced your name right? Thank you.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. The conversation's moved on a little bit since I was initially going to ask my question. So I think there's a few dimensions to it, because mine was mainly around, I know, Richard, you mentioned that every stop and search needs to be reviewed by your supervisor. So my question was more around recording of stop and searches and how that review by the supervisor is done and how in depth it is, and then what happens in those instances where, you know, it's not potentially justified, but they're not potentially as extreme as what's already been mentioned in terms of prosecution and you know, being fired and things like that. Because I also understand from a policing perspective, you do need to have that balance where if a police officer is afraid to say, you know, actually I wasn't too sure about that one, or they're worried about you know, putting on their body cam because they think it might be on shaky grounds, because you know, the consequence might be them being fired, and they are actually thinking about these things, we're pushing it too far in the wrong direction in a sense. So I think it's important to understand how that review's done. And also my other question was about auditing, because although the stop and searches are reviewed by supervisors, I'm sure everyone here will understand that they potentially might have their own biases, or they might not have that professional curiosity that they need to. And, you know, in most professional roles, I'm sure Beresford in working in the trust, regardless of what he does being reviewed by a supervisor, it's still audited randomly on top of that to make sure that, you know, legislation and policy and ethics are upheld.
Great point, Larissa.
So I think there's some really, that's a really good point. So I want to be completely honest, transparent with you. Not every body-worn video is reviewed by a supervisor. It's available with the storage, the digital data that can be stored. It's available to be reviewed. That's why it's important that people, if they're not happy with the interaction, do complain. So it will direct that supervisor to do that. But there's just not the capacity for the supervisor to review everyone. It's reviewed in the sense that the search record is signed off. The other thing that we do monitor is officers who don't record, who aren't using the body-worn video consistently enough. There are, you know, because as I say, dynamically, to be fair to officers, things can happen very quickly and they might not turn it on, or sometimes people make mistakes legitimately. But if we start picking up that that percentage is quite low. We can tell if there's a culture on teams of it not being used, or an individual's not using it very often. But normally we'd have to have, there would be an issue that either that would trigger a supervisor to look at a body-worn video, or there's been a complaint, or there's just a concern about the officer's performance generally. But we are trying to systemize it going forward. So we've systemized it with use of force. So we will routinely check body-worn video for use of force under certain criteria. So that's if force, well, I haven't got it in front of me, but I think it's if you've used a baton strike on someone, if you've hit someone with a baton, if you've used force on someone who's under 12 years old, and there's other triggers, or if someone's been injured, so they needed hospital treatment, or a certain level of visible injury, that automatically gets reviewed by a supervisor. So we're in the process at the moment of trying to develop a policy for stop and search and getting the system to help us with that. And the potential sort of things we would look at is if officers do a lot of self-generated searches and they never find anything, we can pick that data out from the system. I think there's some bits of that we need to make some changes around, but the idea that we're hoping to get in very soon is that when those trigger points come up, they will be looked at by a supervisor. So if you do a search in the scenario I started at the beginning, where a witness says that person over there, points them out, has got a knife, that in some ways is less of a trigger to sort of warrant closer supervision. If most of the searches that an officer does are self-generated, i.e. they are based on people acting suspiciously, then that warrants more supervisory overview of how they're using that power. So those principles to stop and search aren't fully embedded yet, because as Ifti said, it's only over the last few months that we've really got this rich source of data, that starts to afford us opportunities to do that. But I think your point is a really good one that we're taking on board and trying to address.
Can I just follow on from that, Richard? Sorry. Because, and I fully appreciate the points that you've raised, and you know, I appreciate that there's a lack of resources with public services. I think we all do. But there's disparity in, clearly, as you've mentioned already, in the reporting and the raising of concerns around stop and searches compared to how the community actually feel about them. And the criteria that you've just mentioned in terms of when body-worn footage will be reviewed, aside from the hospital themselves reporting those injuries, you're relying on the police officer, essentially, because we know the community aren't raising those concerns. So you're relying on a police officer who, you know, as per, I think it was Bashir's point, is potentially going to be worried about being persecuted because, you know, the negative consequences of doing it wrong can be so high. So I think, you know, given that you've mentioned that you're reviewing the stop and search policy, and it's also been mentioned that you are finally being able to recruit again, you know, after not being able to do so for the last decade, perhaps that auditing is something that could be looked into at that stage, because you do need, you know, someone else independent that's not working within that team, perhaps from somewhere like Suki's team, who is going to have that perspective, because we appreciate someone made the point that it is going to be about, you know, your peers, people you work with, etc., to help you have an understanding of society and the cultural implications. I just think it does need that oversight. So perhaps that's something that could be considered.
Yeah, I think that's good. Those scrutiny panels, there's a potential for the scrutiny panels to do what I think you're driving at there. Is so what we want to get to a position with the scrutiny panels is that they choose what body-worn video they want to view, or we choose them at random. It's not as straightforward as it sounds, because some of the if you just do it like that, some of the body-worn videos are straightforward, or you know, or the scenario, there's not a lot of learning from either side from it. But in terms of transparency, we'd be kind of happy to move to that sort of system. The selection of what ones you look at in the scrutiny panel is tricky, because to do it properly could take, you know, 20-25 minutes of viewing. That's why it's difficult. We can't commit to a supervisor doing every one, so we do need that filter. In terms of the use of forcing around when someone being injured, to be honest, the way the police works, if a police officer injures a member of the public and has to take them to hospital, they would normally be under arrest, or there would be some process, and the police would have to it would be extremely serious if the police didn't document, record, explain, rationalise what they'd done. I appreciate with that comes the trust that you need in the officer to do that fairly and considerately. But if that was just covered up, that would be an extremely serious sort of neglect of duty that would be sort of gross misconduct level. So we're pretty confident around the use of force that we can identify use of force body-worn video, which is not necessarily for stop search, use of any force for arrest or whatever, where an individual has been injured. We're quite confident that we can identify those cases. But no, I think your wider points I agree with. Yeah, I'll take on and
Can
take
I
on
just
board,
ask
you know.
a question?
Just hold us for a minute there, Michelle. I want to go to Yasmin next. And then it's really important to hear from the young people themselves in terms of the impact, because we've got the legislation, and I think, you know, the questions will keep coming, which is good, and we've got another 5 sessions. So let's go to Yasmin next, and then we will really want to hear from the young men in terms of the impact. Yasmin?
Hi, good evening.
Hi.
I'm looking for my question now. I think my thing was just around, I think when Bushra mentioned about the personal safety of officers and sort of around them being aware of their fear, but how fear can often come out as anger and aggression. So it's all very well kind of being aware, but in action, are you aware of how that's coming across and how, because I've had my own interactions with police, especially around mental health, and like there was a lot of use of force, and me, I didn't really report it. Like I had the marks on my wrists and everything when I was in hospital, and I didn't report it. It's nothing to do with stop and search, but this is a example of the use of force and anger and aggression. So just like, I think what I'm trying to say is just for me, that's kind of problematic. And having worked in the prison environment as well and seeing it in there as well. And then the next thing was just around the thing around reports being signed off. How can search reports be signed off without actually reviewing the footage? Like I get in terms of resources, but anybody can write a report and just hope that their video is not seen, and it can kind of get swept under the rug. So it's kind of neglectful to sign something off without actually reviewing the footage, in my opinion. I think that's about it. And I think Larissa already kind of mentioned it, my questions. She asked both of them, kind of. So,
Absolutely, yeah. And Richard?
Yeah, so on both those bits, I think, so first of all, on the officers, the fear thing, yeah, I sort of recognise what you're saying there, and I think this is part of the conversation needs to be both ways as well. And I know it's a difficult and contentious thing to say, but being a police officer can be very frightening. The other side of my role is that I always speak to all my officers that get assaulted, and that is a daily. I'm in charge of 1,000 officers, so it's a lot of people. But every day or every other day, I have to speak to officers who've been assaulted. I was speaking to one last week who's had his teeth knocked out of his face, glasses smashed into his eyes, officers being run over by vehicles. So, you know, this not to make excuses. There's no excuse for bad behaviour or people being disrespectful, but that is the other side of this. So, and this is why it's so important that we have events like this to bring both sides together, to try and understand perspectives from both sides, and how, you know, that's interesting that, because even our narrative here, isn't it, have been around how younger officers coming in are a lot more positive and upbeat, and more experienced ones are like cynical. And I get what we're driving at, but some of that is because of fear and experience and being injured and being assaulted. I'm not saying it's an excuse, but it is an explanation. And the more we talk to each other and there's more understanding, the better that will be. The sign-off thing, you're right, it would be better if a supervisor checked every body-worn video, but there simply is not enough time. And even if the police service was perfectly resourced, you just wouldn't, because the nature of being a sergeant is you would be in charge of, say, 8 or 9, 10 officers, and you can't double check everything they do in body-worn video. So we do need to have a system by which we pick out the ones that are concerning, and the system that we're looking at is thinking about, well, hang on, some of these searches aren't all the same. The ones based on suspicion, where you always don't find anything, or you find something that you weren't looking for. So that's something I feel quite strongly about, is if we're looking for a knife, which is a priority for us, and we find a small amount of personal drugs, which is not a priority for the police, it's illegal, then that's something we need to think about if that's all our searches ever produce, and they're the ones we need to scrutinise. So we do need to be sort of directed in what we supervise because of resources.
Thank you, Richard.
Yes, Ferris, I was going to say, we got a lot.
I'm going to hand over to you now.
I was going to say, yeah, first of all, as everyone, thanks for tuning in. Some good questions there. I think good points. And I think the beauty of this topic as well, from my perspective, is we could keep talking about this all day because it's that important. And obviously everyone chiming in shows that we care, but we'll touch on all these questions at the end. I kind of want to start looking at the impact. From my personal perspective, I've become a little bit immune to stop and searches and the police as well. I know we've got Grayson as well, he's here, and Ryan. Obviously, Grayson, you yourself being a co-founder, I know your reasons for kind of wanting to start this. So how would you perceive your impact of stop and searches upon yourself as an adult, and kind of how that shaped your relationship, how you've seen that with a lot of young people you've worked with?
Yeah, so I think for me, obviously when I was 17, being stopped and searched for the first time, it was a bit like, okay, what's all this about? Because I was in a car with a group of friends, there's a car to the left of me, that person's on his mobile phone, police officer, he's followed our car, pulled us over, he's then explained, you guys look suspicious. Okay, fair enough, if you think something suspicious is going on, that's cool, that's in your own right to do your job. But then when I've asked, did you see the person who was on their phone in the car? Yeah, I saw that person, but you look more suspicious. Now that puts me as a 17-year-old in that position to think, well, okay, now you're just looking at myself and my friends in a bad light and we haven't even done anything. And I think from speaking to some of the young people in the area, two of the main points that they've come across is the fairness and the misunderstanding. They feel like it's not fair speaking to a 13-year-old kid who's been stopped and searched 8 to 10 times, to the point now where he just, anytime he sees police, he just puts his hand up, he's ready to get searched. He hasn't done anything. I think at 13, that shouldn't be happening. That doesn't seem right to me. In terms of the misunderstanding, I feel like something that, as Rakeem said earlier, that generational aspect of things, I think because there's so much misunderstanding between the generations, the older generation probably within the police force won't understand the younger generation now. The younger generation, they see things differently within the world. So they obviously come with their words and speaking and whatnot. And as Yasmin said, that fear, if you fear what you don't understand. So I feel like, if the older generation of police, they see a young person and they feel like they're speaking to them in an arrogant, disrespectful way, then, the young person, they're going to speak back because they're feeling that they're being disrespected. And something that Richard said earlier about the complaints, I think, going back to that 13-year-old kid, he's been searched 8 to 10 times. He's now numb to being stopped and searched. Why is he going to complain? It makes no sense to him. And even speaking to him and asking him why, he wouldn't. He was just like, what's the point? No one's going to listen to me. No one's going to take on board what I'm saying, because as soon as they see me, it's just, excuse me, could you come over here, please? Stop and search. So I think that's where we kind of have the disconnection with the young people, is because we're misunderstanding what they're about. If you see a young person in a tracksuit, that is now the trend. That's what young people wear nowadays. We shouldn't just look and think they're suspicious because you're wearing a tracksuit. That's what's in. That's what they know is normal. It may not be normal to us as an older generation, but to them, that's the norm. And also just the fairness, go and have a conversation with that young person. Don't just look at him and think, oh, because, he's in a tracksuit or he looks a certain way or he's perceived he's wearing a hoodie, I must go and stop and search. No, have a conversation. You're right. How's your day going? And you can kind of build a rapport from there, really. But I feel like those are the two main points where we have a disconnection with the young people.
Yeah, man, I like that. I like that.
So I'll just come back on that quickly, Grace. So I think what I'd say is, but this is where there is a material change, and that's what I was saying at the beginning around acknowledging what's happened in the past. So with your thing you've described there, it sounds like the grounds for the search weren't described adequately, and that is not acceptable. So, but what is different between probably when that happened and now is if you did complain about that, there's a 95% chance that will be recorded on body-worn video, and that would, when people complain, I can say we will look at that body-worn video. And if it isn't recorded, then we'll ask why. And there might not be an adequate explanation, and then we can deal with that. And then we can look more deeply into what the record is. And it could be that we look at it and we say, actually, we think it's all right. And then we can have a conversation with you. So I appreciate in the past we couldn't have done that. But that's why going forward, it's so important that recognise there's a bit of a change now because of technology and the commitment, I think, from the organisation to change. That we can kind of work on those things going forward. But I totally get what you're saying, but I'm just saying looking forward, this is what we need to try and address.
Perfect. I'm going to come to you after Ifti. I think what you said, Richard, it's spot on as in terms of taking into account the technology, how we can move forward. But it's important to remember and recognise we are still members of the community. The police are still in the same uniform. And I know something that we've said in our meetings, from when you have one bad encounter, that can ruin it for the foreseeable future. It's took me many conversations with yourselves to think, do you know what? They're not all that bad. But let's be totally honest. If I go down to the street and I get stopped and searched and someone speaks to me in a negative tone, I'm not having it. And as we said before, if they said to you, when you said, Richard, if an officer asked you, what's your name? You'd freely say, yeah, I'm here. Me personally, I'm in a position, I'm mature enough to host this webinar with yourselves, to go and do training. I still don't feel obliged to have that conversation. And because I don't feel as though I have to. And I think it's kind of the efforts, what we're trying to do now is to overturn, I don't want to say the mess that's been created, but that one bad interaction has a long lasting effect. I see you with your hand up there, Ifti. Do you want to touch on that as well?
Yeah, sorry.
Sure,
Myself, I was just going to ask Grayson really a question. He talks about that disconnect. And I'm just wondering, where do you think we need to kind of pitch our work? How do you think we can bridge that gap?
I think it's the conversational aspect, as Joaquin just touched on. I think the whole technology now with the body cameras, that's a fair point. We can always go back, we can review, we can look over things. But I feel like you have to have that verbal notion. When you go and speak to a young person on the street, how are you approaching them? How are you speaking to them? And I think that's where we kind of bridge the gap. Let's not just talk at them. Let's not, because as a young person, you don't want anybody talking at you. Even as a kid, your parents are going, clean your room, You don't want them screaming at you, but talk to me, have a conversation with me. If I'm in the wrong, I'm in the wrong. But as Joaquin said, it's took a long time, to have a conversation with Suki and, over the police force to really think, okay, well, not everyone's bad. But for me to go and explain that to a 13-year-old that's been stopped and searched and been spoken to a type of way, he's not going to take that on board. So I think it's just more the verbal aspect, let's build the bridge that way.
I'm just going to add to that as well. I think it's important to recognise, although it sounds great, it looks good. Let's be honest. Look at the statistics. The statistics are still the statistics as of today. A black person, a person who looks just like me, when I check my phone and I look on the internet, I see in America someone who looks like me being killed by police officers. I see people from my own city in West Midlands are more likely to be stopped and searched. I see disproportionality in jails. And I'm never once going to sit on here and say, someone give me the answer, because I don't know the answer. Could we say it's subconscious bias, it's racial profiling? We all have our own views of these things. For me, it's, okay, if these interactions are going to happen from today moving forward, can we better the communication? Can we ensure that that's better? Because if it's going to happen, if I've got to, and I think Hobbs touched on it as well in terms of legitimacy, and we touched on it in the training about the lesser force and the weaker individual has to accept the forces that are being placed upon them and trust that they're enacted correctly. So if these forces are to be enacted, can we sit back and say, you know what, I trust the police not to really overstep the mark? Me possibly right now, I honestly don't. I trust yourselves when we have our meetings, but there's still 1,000 others that are still carrying out their day-to-day roles. And I know we've got a few hands up as well, but I'm just going to go to Ryan first to touch on this, and then we'll go through some of the questions at the end, if that's okay. So yeah, Ryan, do you want to talk about the impact and how you perceived it as well?
Yeah, I think the impact is definitely strong when people get stopped and searched. Me personally, I've been a lucky one. Like I've said on the radio before, I've never been stopped and searched in my life. Like I said, I'm the lucky one. But I have had family members, friends that have been stopped and searched. I've seen people be stopped and searched. And that affects me because I've seen it. That's an emotional trauma that I've seen many times. Black people going around, when they see the police, yeah, we do feel a type of way. Our heart rate might go up. We don't have anything on us, but it's just the feeling that we have when we see the police. So what we're trying to do at Bouncing is bridge the gap, make that connection with the police force and break down those barriers where we don't have to have that elevation in the heart rate when we see the police car come past. So it's more so, okay, I see the police car. It's an everyday thing. It's not a thing where we're getting scared or the next generation are going to be getting dealt with even worse than we are. Like Rakeem touched on, in America, where you see people getting killed every day, young black people, young people from the BAME community, and it is happening in this country as well. It's just not getting spotlighted as much. So I think we just need to kind of keep doing the training that Rakeem and Bushra have started, and then we've just got to keep pushing it to a wider scale because, like Bushra said, the 5 officers that did take part on it, all of them have taken at least one thing away from it and has improved their policing. So that's my point on that, definitely.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think what you said as well, it's key to understand, once again, these long-lasting effects. And it's funny enough how he says, I'm a lucky one. I get a giggle, like, why is he lucky? Because you haven't been stopped. I can think of times when I've been there. I remember we was younger in Sutton Park. 3 white kids, they robbed the mobile phone. I said this at the training day, Busha. I said, they robbed the phone. Them like, what? The police came. I ran. I've seen police. I'm running. I'm 16. I'm not staying around for police. I run. 4 or 5 black people run. The 3 white boys walk off. They're the ones that ran the phone. Police ran straight past them, stopped us, handcuffs out, tasers, 6 cars. What's going on here? But he's just walked off scot-free. It makes no sense. But then now as I've grown older and I've grown wiser, I'm understanding it. And for me, it's scary knowing that this is the world I live in. These are the times I live in. And I know Larissa had some good points about auditing. And we said, okay, the supervisors are going to look at the footage. But we just said in the training sessions, the ones that have been there the longest aren't really understanding it. So it's a bit of a catch-22 from that aspect. But I think to be fair to where we've come to date, as I wanted to touch on basically from my perspective as well for everyone listening, what we have done so far, because I think it kind of be unfair for me to say we haven't been working. So I know with Beresford, it's been a couple of years in the making. All came off a radio conversation. And to date now, so we've done a video, Suki, a nice video to be fair. That's going to be shown to a lot of officers with their training. I managed to give my little input, write a script. And to be honest, some of the videos and the feedback and some of the stop and searches there are horrendous. One kid, he's gone to town to buy trainers. Somehow he's been stop and searched and firearms, and now he's in the police station getting strip searched. But we're going to act like it's fine when it's just not fine. Renee, who's not here today, who's a volunteer, and even he's trying to break down barriers. He was stopped outside KFC. In his video, he talks about the officer said, we come to stop people. We're looking for a specific individual. He's wearing jeans. He looks down. He's like, I'm wearing tracksuits. And he still stopped. But these are the kind of the norms. So we've been working with that as well. As we said with Richard, we've run the pilot to the training with the officers as well, which is kind of a blessing to where we've been to date. As Richard said, he's got his whole force, over 1,000 officers. So looking towards delivering that training, trying to get through those. And I like to think as members of the public listening now, we've kind of got the benefits of the community at the heart. And in terms of the feedback that we did get from the training, I think everyone said yes, or more mindful of their positive interactions, community's feelings, better place, how to communicate. So that's a definite good one there. We're in the process as well with the bid as well for the schools, delivering workshops to the schools as well in terms of kind of build up this mindfulness. And I know Suki's been talking a lot with the school link officers as well. They're on board because in my personal opinion, again, some of the sessions that are being delivered in schools at the moment, they're a bit shoddy if I'm being totally honest. But as long as people are willing to learn, and I think once again, why I appreciate Richard, Ifti, Bushra, Sokia, everyone here, Hobbs, everyone that's came on board with this mission, is because when it comes down to it, this is all came from officers as well, sitting down thinking, actually, this needs to change. And I know Beresford, you really wanted to drive home this digital platform. So yeah, I think it's been great. Everyone's here tonight. I think, as we said, we've got sessions first Friday every month, and just wanted to touch on some of these questions, and we've been kind of bombarded, being totally honest here.
If we can link, we're going to run over a little bit, so that's just to let people know. But I think there's a couple of 3 questions that we need to focus on, Ricky. If you pick this up, so there's Carmen's question, Beverly's points, and I think it's Sarir as well.
We've got some hands up as well. You know, do you want to go to that first? Because
let's try and go to those as well. Yeah.
I know, Dawn, you've got your hand up. I'll come to you after Gita. So yeah, Dawn, what did you want to say? Open forum for you to speak up.
Hi. So I'm not a young person. I'm just a real member of the community, and I haven't been forced to come here. And you know, I would like to call myself a mother and a grandmother, but sadly, because I'm a mother of a black young male, I have to call myself an activist, which is a real shame. And the reason why I have to call myself an activist is because of, you know, our lived experience of policing in Birmingham. Now, I'm not going to talk about, you know, the normal thing in terms of the stop and search that I've had to witness. My son, who's an upstanding member of the community, has never been to prison, he doesn't do anything, you know, but still, you know, both my sons get harassed on a regular basis, but I'm not here to talk about that. I want to address some of the comments that Yasmin and Grayson made. In particular, I thought it was a bit rude that when Yasmin made her comment, it was just glazed over. So I'm going to share my story. I wasn't going to originally do this, but I thought, you know, it needs to be addressed. So my story is a bit of a crossbreed between Yasmin and Grayson's. So I was brought up long time ago to think that the Bobby on the beat, as we used to call it, was there to protect everybody, and especially, you know, as a young lady growing up in the UK. And, you know, we were brought up to think that, you know, that we have to be aware of the fact that there's going to be this monster on the street who could potentially rob you, rape you, or whatever it is. But the most harrowing experience I've ever had was being stopped and searched by police. And I was only driving down the road, just like Grayson, just like everybody else who shared their story. I was on the way to a nightclub. I was dressed in an LBD, a little black dress. I couldn't even conceal a weapon if I wanted to in it. You know, it's a very tight dress. I had a handbag that could only get my keys and a £20 note in it. I couldn't conceal anything. And we were stopped, and we was forced. You know, I was there with my friend. There was only the 2 of us. Lucky enough, we were together. And, you know, we were forced to get out of the car for no reason. You know, originally we didn't want to get out of the car because we were scared. We opened the back door, opened the boot. It was on a latch, so you could just open the latch to the boot, and so they could search it. So we didn't have to get out of the car. They still forced us, and it was a very harrowing. I could go on forever, but it was a very harrowing experience. And I didn't report it, just like Yasmin, because at that time there wasn't anything to protect me. The Race Relations Act, Amendment Act, was only done in 2000. This was before 2000, and there was just nothing to protect us. And also, it was a time where if I was to report it, even to the males in my family who would like to protect, you know, they'd like to protect the black, you know, the black female, it would just cause an uproar. I'm a popular person, confident. I don't get off to any trouble. I help everybody. If I was to tell anybody this story, you know, a whole riot would take place. So how do we address the abuse of power of police officers?
Well, thanks for sharing that. I think the first thing is that, you know, I acknowledge what you say about Yasmin did mention that she had been injured when she'd had an interaction with the police, and I didn't address that, and I'm sorry about that. You know, I did acknowledge what she said, but there was a couple of other points that I probably over-focused on. I mean, all I can say is, in terms of your experience you've shared there, so thank you for sharing with me, and I take it on board. I mean, all I can say is part of the legacy that's fed into what we're trying to move to kind of sort out. And, you know, all I can say is that I've taken board what you've said, and it's trying to acknowledge, as I said at the beginning, that history of what's happened in the past, and just try and look forward to trying to see how we can make sure that, you know, these problems are resolved for the future, and emphasising the things that have changed, and the opportunities. I know we talked a lot around about body-worn video, but I think the attitude of the service is different. I do think there are changes, and there's a platform to move it forward. But having been through what you've described, I appreciate that you talking to me now might not have a lot of trust in what I'm saying, but I can only sincerely kind of take on board what you said and stand by what I've said previously, really.
I mean, just to echo what Grayson was saying, you know, I don't think any young person, 13, 14, 15, 16, any woman or anybody should have to go through continual harassment for no reason. It's very, very traumatic. I saw Beverly's statement, and I hope Beverly just come in. Both myself, Beverly, and everybody, we've seen this in the 70s, we've seen it in the 80s, we've seen it in the 90s. It never really changes. I've grown up, I've got children, I've got grandchildren, and we're still having this conversation. Why are we still having this conversation?
Well, what I would say is, you know, my perception of things, I've been in the police 20 years, I do think things have changed. And I appreciate you might disagree with that, but I think what reflects the change is the fact that, to a certain extent, I'm here and I'm talking to you and I'm listening to what you're saying and taking that on board. And I'm in charge of a lot of police officers, and I am trying to drive these things forward and sort them out for the future. And to answer your question directly, it is not lawful for someone to be harassed, and it shouldn't happen. So it's as simple as that, by a police officer, by anyone else. And people shouldn't be stopped without justification. The law is really clear, and it's always been clear. So, you know, where we probably disagree is that I think things are moving forward, and I respect your opinion that you might not agree with that, but I think things are different from the 70s and the 80s to what they are now. But that's my kind of narrative on it, really.
Brilliant. On that point, I think Beverly, if you could make your points, and Carmen, if you could also make your point, because I think your point links to what Grayson and the rest of the guys, Rakeem, are trying to do. But Beverly, if you could make your point, that'd be really helpful. Beverly, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right.
I put my statement on the chat, and Dawn mentioned it. You know, I was a community worker in Handsworth in the late 70s, beginning of the 80s, and where I spent a lot of my time, you know, bailing young kids out and going to the magistrate courts and Crown Court. And we've had several, you know, and those days it was called the sus law. People could just, you know, police used to just stop young people, arrest them, sometimes for nothing. You know, I started a business in the 80s, and I sent late 80s, and I one day I sent my 2 sons to the bank to bank the money from my business, and they ended up in Ladywood police station. They were locked up because they looked like somebody that looked suspicious. I had to get, you know, solicitor to bail them out. And I'm saying, since the late 70s, 80s, we've been having these discussions about stop and search, the sus law. You know, we've had this Carmen report in 1981. And I can't see what has changed. Here we are, 2021, discussing the same thing on the same subject and saying things will be better, you know? And I can't see where it is better. I feel so sad. I'm an old woman now, and we're still here discussing the same stop and search. Change it, the name changes over time, but nothing changes. When are we going to be seen as just equal people and not being looking suspicious because you're Black?
Thanks, Beverly.
Well,
Grayson?
Yeah. Go on, Grayson.
Sorry. Now I'd like to touch on that point 100% and say that, you know, it is scary to think that, you know, in 2021, we are still having this conversation. You know, there's been generations before us that have sat down and spoke on it. So I'd definitely like to say that's a good point there.
Beresford, can we just come back on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
So stop and search 30 years ago was contentious when I joined the police. I've left, and it's still, and I think it will be in 30 years' time. But 5 years ago, we were doing about 60,000 searches a year. We do about 12,500. So we've reduced our stop and search by over 75%, something like that. I'm not sure the exact figures, but certainly we do far less. We're far more focused, and we at a click of a mouse, you can get who's been searched and look at the grounds. Whereas back in the day, it was old hand records, and we wouldn't even necessarily see those. So the efficiency around how we scrutinise has improved significantly. We do far less, and we are more, and they're more effective. Is the point I wanted to make. Notwithstanding the points that we've made, and I've listened and we've heard loud and clear the point about actually we've got it on body worn. We should be scrutinising that far more, and those officers, and we will accept that there are officers that do let the rest of us down. They're the ones we need to identify and get out of the organisation. So I think progress has been made, but there's still a lot to be done.
Okay. Carmen, just want to ask you if you wanted to make your points.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. I will do. It was just to say that I appreciate the work that has been done so far here in the West Midlands to improve the relationships with the police services and our local communities. But I just think, however, there's a lot of negativity from our younger generation, particularly our young teenagers, more so since the Black Lives Matter incidents, especially I'm referring more likely to George Floyd and several other young black men that have been killed by the hands of the police. And now I think during lockdown, I have seen, I've got a 15-year-old and a 14-year-old, and I've seen the effect that had on them. They've always heard of this, but they've never actually seen it played out. So I think it affected them so much, their mental health, that they couldn't even study. And I kind of got where they were coming from, and obviously they need a lot of support. Now, my question is, how is the police services are going to engage with these young teenagers? Because at the moment, there is no way that they are interested in becoming police officers. How are you going to recruit this young generation, changing attitudes? Because at the moment, and like I said before, I appreciate the work that's been done so far, but there's still a lot of work to do. And I think I heard Rakeem say about workshops in schools, which I think is a really good idea, but I think there needs to be more of a presence on a regular basis in schools, almost as if the police officer was a teacher there to help to change attitudes and behaviours. So that was my statement, really.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that. Rakeem, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, sorry, Rakeem.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead,
Richard.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of schools officers, obviously during the cuts, we the amount of officers that we had dedicated to schools, to come under pressure. As we go forward with the uplift, there's that potential to kind of improve that. I do think, though, that the stuff that we're talking about, the fundamentals of making sure that when we do use that stop and search power, it's used lawfully, properly, and in a respectful way, and there's that scrutiny of it, is also going to be really important, because however much work you do in a school with a young person, like, it would be undone if the police don't discharge that power out in the street immediately, as Rakeem's kind of highlighted, potentially for generations to come. So I think we're concentrating on the right stuff to some extent, but I do take on board what you're saying, and actually with the uplift, more visibility of police in schools is one of the things the force are investing in as we sort of go forward.
Okay, brilliant. Just a point of note.
I was going to say, can we go? We got a couple of hands up. Can we go to?
Yeah, I just want to say to people
as well within society. So if you want to fire across your statement, a question, go ahead.
Hiya, yeah. So I wanted to quickly ask. So Suki, you mentioned a little bit about the representation of the force, and so in society we were able to speak to the current police crime and commissioner, David Jameson, and he highlighted how whilst you've not got massive amount of ethnic diversity, he also highlighted you've got 2% black officers, and to me that felt alarming, considering like the issues around stop and search, because you'd hope for there to be more diversity in the force in order to kind of prevent that. And so I wanted to know, what are you doing to as a force to kind of try to recruit more black officers in particular? And my second point was, I know I mentioned a little bit about the bill in the comments, but I think my concern was that if currently police officers who are consistently using the kind of suspicious behaviour for stop and searches and they're being supervised, what's going to, because this bill is likely to come into power, and I know it's still in the process, we're still in the first few stages. If it does come into power where police judgment then police basically get more powers, and it goes off their own judgment, and so you get, when people are loud and disorderly gets judged off police, just like suspicious behaviour gets judged off police. What would then be done to kind of prevent police abusing their powers again? And so I think it's more of a concern on my end that I was kind of trying to erase. But yeah, so that was it from me.
Okay, the question I'll be able to answer is about the recruitment, and yes, there is an issue with recruiting more people from the ethnic minorities, especially with black people. And again, it's like, how do there's obviously an underlying issue, and it's trying to understand what that issue and that disconnect is. And for me personally, I think the only way we can try and get more people into the organisation to be representative of their communities is to start doing this type of engagement and this type of work. And somebody in the chat has said that, like, why aren't the police, initiating these discussions? And when I started my work last year to try and get some young black people to talk to me as a police officer, you wouldn't understand how difficult that was. And it's like getting people who trust to build that bridge, for example, like Bouncing Statistics, to open up a platform as such to get the police involved and start these kind of discussions, and trying to work through those and try to get that connected. Again, it's trying to build that trust and respect again. There's some things that happen in the history of policing that, like for myself, I've been in for 14 years. I won't be able to answer to that because I wasn't part of the policing. But what I can say, what I've been doing since I have joined the police force, and within our organisation, the officers that we work with, if we see something that we don't agree with, we'll pull that up ourselves. I've worked hard in my career to get where I have. I don't want someone within the organisation undoing that hard work, and I'm sure my colleagues in this chat would agree with that as well. So a lot of the emphasis would be, as if we see something that's wrong, we should be reporting that, and which we do. And I would say, the slow process that's been made, but with the help with the community that we're trying to build these bridges with, that's the only way we can move forward and find out where that distrust is. If there's issues, if there's a bad stop and search, tell us there's a bad stop and search. We'll investigate that. We will look into it. We don't want, as an organisation, we're there to serve and protect. And if our officers are not doing that, they need to be highlighted, and only then we can say, maybe we're not doing anything where we are doing something.
Sorry, can I just quickly add as well? I just wanted to highlight as well, I think the other element is as well that sometimes we're quick to say there's more diversity and all of that as well. But I know as a South Asian, there's a lot of anti-blackness within the South Asian community. And so I think that also plays a part in stop and searches with there being, sorry, I can hear some playback. So with there being only 2% of black officers, that's why I emphasise that as well. But yeah, thank you for your response.
Perfect. I was gonna say, can we just go to see? I'm kind of conscious of time as well.
Yeah, me too. So let me just generally say to everyone,
go to CJ. Go to CJ. Is that his handle for you?
I'm just going to let people know that we are running over. So if people are happy to stay, let's just stay. It's clearly an important issue, and maybe we've underestimated the time. So maybe we should be thinking about 2 hours as opposed to 1.5 hours. So that's one of our learnings for today, and that's great as well. So CJ, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you Bouncing Statistics for putting on this amazing seminar. I've kind of just been in the background listening. I don't want to take up too much time. I just wanted to ask a few questions, really. The first one was, so in terms of engagement from ethnic minority communities, have you seen an increase in engagement in terms of people who are seeking employment from the Asian community? And if so, why do you think that is? And the second question is, what benefit would it be to a young Black person or a person from a minority community anyway to be a police officer? What would be the benefit of that, as opposed to any other career option? And then the third point I had was, are there any shadowing opportunities for a young person to go and see what a police officer actually does, what the different roles are within the police service, and how you're actually helping people? Because if the only engagement that a young person has with the police is one of being stopped and searched or being perceived as a criminal in some sense, we're not really seeing the other side of the coin. My engagement, I do a lot of work with young people and supporting my local community, but my engagement, as well as many others in here, with the police has been one of a negative, perspective in terms of being stopped and searched quite a few times. And, I've had no criminal engagement. So that's kind of the 3 points I just wanted to ask. It might be quite a lot to go into right now, but that's kind of just what I was thinking.
Beresford, I've got to leave at 9 o'clock, I'm afraid. So, but I will be doing the future sessions, so I'm committed to doing that. I think there's only one that I can't do, and I'll get my 2IC to help with. So I'm sorry about that. But
Yeah,
in
no
terms
problem.
of that, Vicky might be able to give a bit more detail. I mean, I think the overview is that we are struggling to recruit the people that we want in terms of from the Black community and from the Asian community. And that is, a real concern, because it means we're not using the opportunity of the uplift to make ourselves more representative and to get the benefits of that. But Suki might have a bit more detail on it. But just to be transparent, the fact of the matter is we aren't attracting the recruits that we would like. In terms of what would be in it for a person joining the police, I mean, I've been in the police for 20 years and I've absolutely thoroughly enjoyed every minute of it. I've done all sorts of interesting things. I know you don't really want, this isn't about pitching for the police, but I've had a really diverse and interesting career. I've spent a lot of time investigating child abuse, domestic abuse, working in public protection. There's other career paths in terms of surveillance and all sorts of different, interesting things. And I suppose it's also emphasising, yes, that there is this bit of policing where we're discharging these powers. It's really contentious and it causes all this hurt and pain. But I would say that, universally it's accepted you do need to have a police force. And I spent a lot of my career dealing with, say, child abuse. And that's something we would all agree with, when people are abusing children and paedophiles need to be brought to justice. And I feel like I've contributed a lot to society and had a really successful and interesting and challenging at times career doing that. And it's not always just about it's a whole spectrum of different things that you get involved in. I encourage anyone to join, really. But I will drop out at 9 o'clock, Barry. So I'm sorry to be so rude. It's just I'm on call for the elections and the accounts ongoing. I've just got to check in with them around a couple of issues. But I'll drop out at 9 if that's okay.
No problem. Thank you for joining.
I'm a bit conscious of myself, so literally like to wrap it up kind of there, guys. I'd like to say thank you, obviously, to everyone for being involved in this open space, and I really look forward to the next ones that we do have. Obviously, the next date that we have is the 4th of June. So obviously we'll all come back together in this space, and any other questions that haven't been answered will be saved and we will answer them on next time. Special mention to obviously In Society for coming through as well. Thank you to I Am My Sister as well, CIC, for taking part. Thank you to Richard North, Suki, Bushra, Ifti, Beresford as well. And also anybody that obviously wants to be in collaboration with Bouncing Statistics in terms of, becoming a mentor or, working alongside us, don't hesitate to go to info@bouncingstatistics.com. Obviously, we've got the Instagram page as well, @bouncingstatistics, and also you can check out the website that we have is www.bouncingstatistics.com, and you can always get in touch with us. So yeah, thank you guys.
Yeah, just to second everything he said. Thanks for taking our time. It's Friday night. Obviously, no one's really got anything to do anyway. I like to think so. But as I said, for us, it's powerful. This space is powerful. I know it's a bit upsetting for me as well, really, how we didn't get to touch on all of the questions, because I think every question's key, and everyone I felt. And I know someone else said about, imagine how it must feel to feel as though you're having to speak to someone to say, just come on, why is this happening? And it is draining, but I think everyone that's in here today is showing directly that they care and you stand for something. And I personally, all the boys that are part of this, I know a lot of members on the team are here as well. And I see Marcus through, James is here, Jade, Sean's here, all the members on this team that are here, we all believe in making this change. And if there are ways, once again, that we can all collab together, I know Dawn spoke earlier, she's been doing great work for us as well behind the scenes. Just literally, once again, info@thebouncingstatistics.com. Same thing, Bouncing Statistics on the Insta, www.bouncingstatistics.com on the internet. And we can keep it moving, because the more people behind this mission, the better. And I can honestly say, from where we started to now, don't get me wrong, it's tiring. I do have a little moan here and now again, say, Sucky, what's going on? Sucky, I'm done with this. But now we keep moving forward. Richard's on board, and as long as we've got the right people, yourselves, once again, it's a blessing to get this far. And Beresford, thanks as well for hosting this. I know with yourself, you can touch on the mental health aspect, because I know we didn't really touch on that a lot today. But yeah, thanks a lot, people, for taking out your Friday night. It's very, very much appreciated to the bottom of my heart.
So yeah, just to follow on from what Rakeem was saying, I'd just like to thank everybody in the West Midlands Police Force for joining us and showing your support to build change and create change. Also, Beresford coming along, giving us the mental health aspect. Next month, we will be touching on that a little bit more. So definitely stay tuned for the upcoming dates. Like Grayson said, we do have June, July, August, September, and October, okay? So it's going to be the first Friday of every month coming forward. I'll see everybody there. Also, spread the word. Tell your friends, tell your family. If they want to get their voice heard, they know where to come. Okay, Eventbrite, get your tickets for next month, because they sold out very, very fast. Like Rakeem said, and like Grayson said, bouncingstatistics.com, Instagram, Bouncing Statistics, Twitter, @BouncingStats. So yeah, I just want to thank everybody for coming along. And Beres, if you want to give us a little outro as well, or Richard North, before you've got to jet off. But yeah, I appreciate everybody coming in, supporting the journey and pushing the mission.
Okay, then. I was hoping Richard was going to take that. Again.
Oh, sorry.
Clearly,
Yeah, no, well.
no,
sorry, no,
clearly,
thank you very much for inviting me. Go on, Beres, you go first.
Yeah, it's clearly an important space. And let's use the digital platform to have the discussion. You know, I think Dawn, I think Beverly, and Michelle make points about, actually, this is going on since the SUS days in the 70s. But I think now is the time to use this kind of space to make some real change. It's frustrating. And again, my grandchildren and my children are going through the same kind of experience. It's frustrating, it's tiring, but unless we continue to have discussion, nothing's going to change. So, Richard, you can have the last word.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Sorry, I had to cut it off at 9, but as it's sort of been emphasised, it's going to be other sessions and other opportunities. But no, thank you very much for letting me come and answer your questions and sort of talk through those issues. And then, yeah, look forward to speaking to you again. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See you later, everyone. Bye.